So I've started the recording, and I also say a very warm welcome, and I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers, Stephanie Schnurr and Rachel Rowntree from the University of Warwick. Stephanie is a professor there, mainly working at professional and medical communication. Sorry, I can't see. Yes, someone has let him in. And on leadership, discourse, and narratives. And Rachel is a PhD student at Warwick, and both of them are going to present on those kinds of companies. They can't just deal with me, exploring narratives about neurodiversity, leadership, and gender in the workplace. Very warm welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael and Johannes. Really good to be here. We're very excited to have this opportunity to present this research here. What we're presenting here today, I've just said this before you all came in to Michael, is very much work in progress. So this is a paper that Rachel and I are currently working on with the title that Michael's just kindly read out. And it's part of a larger PhD project that Rachel is working on. And yeah, so she'll tell you a little bit more about her PhD project as we go through the talk. Okay, and now let's keep fingers crossed that this works. Yes, okay, brilliant. Oh no, I knew this would happen. Okay, right, okay, so ADHD and neurodiversity. So those of you living in an English-speaking country, or probably any country at the moment, know that this is quite a bit of a topic at the moment in mainstream media, and we find a lot of mainstream media, especially in the English-speaking world, which is what we've got here, talking about ADHD at work. So Rachel's put together a few headlines that she found in the UK, Canada, and the US. Yeah, just to give you a brief overview, really, of kind of the attention that this topic receives at the moment. Now, ADHD and neurodiversity more generally, as I said, are currently widely debated in mainstream media, and the headlines that we've just seen are just some examples of this. Just to give you a few numbers, there are almost 400 million adults worldwide that are currently diagnosed with ADHD, and so this is the diagnosed number, so you can imagine that the real number is probably much higher than this, and 2 million alone in the UK. And yet, in spite of this kind of recent interest and this kind of widespreadness, probably the wrong word, but anyway, the widespread of ADHD, we still have a very limited understanding of the lived experiences of people with ADHD, especially in a workplace context. And as far as we know, there's no research from a sociolinguistic perspective. And of course, this is where Rachel, with her wonderful PhD project, comes in. And as I said, you'll hear more about this later. Okay, so ADHD, as I'm sure you know anyway, stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, which is a neurodevelopmental disorder that's characterized by impairing levels of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. And we've just listed some of a rather long list of symptoms according to the official website of the NHS, which is the National Health Service in the UK. So symptoms are things like carelessness and lack of attention to detail, continually starting new tasks before finishing old ones, inability to focus or prioritize, etc., etc. Okay, so ADHD, it kind of feels like we're only slowly beginning to understand what it is, how it works, and what effects it has. And in particular, in a workplace context, we know very little about ADHD. A lot of research that exists largely focuses on occupational difficulties and deficits that are caused by ADHD, or there's research that kind of explores work-related problems and impairments of adults with ADHD. And among the issues that are identified in a workplace context by previous research, we have things like experiencing workplace interactions as confusing and often overwhelming, difficulties in coping with job demands, developing coping and accommodation strategies. And without wanting to go into too much detail here, because I've just learned we only have 30 minutes, not 40 as we thought, so I better be quick. But what we can see with this literature is that it very much frames ADHD as a problem, okay? And we would say this in itself is a problem. Most of the research that currently exists is quantitative, and there are obviously problems with this that we won't go into detail here. And this research often focuses on identifying and describing some of the problems and issues caused or enhanced by ADHD. So very much framing ADHD as a significant obstacle to success in the workplace. Across the research that currently exists, there are largely two paradigms. So one is the pathology paradigm, and the research that I've described so far fits into this. The pathology paradigm asks, what do we do about the problem of these people not being normal? So kind of framing ADHD as a problem, as like a deficit. And then we have what's called the neurodiversity paradigm, which takes a very different perspective and asks, what do we do about the problem of people being oppressed, marginalized, and poorly accommodated by the prevailing culture? And obviously, what we're presenting today and Rachel's research very much falls within the second of those two paradigms. There are not very many, but there are a handful of studies that challenge this widespread assumption that ADHD is a problem at work. And they list a few specific strengths of ADHD, such as working under pressure, intense energy and completing urgent tasks, multitasking, task switching, visible enthusiasm, perseverance, etc., etc. Now, where does gender come into this mix? Well, the problem is that ADHD is traditionally viewed as a male-only disorder. And so the number of boys diagnosed with ADHD is much, much higher than the number of girls diagnosed. So you can see at the statistics that we've got here, the ratio is 3-to-1. Now, in adulthood, and we're talking like mid-40s, like proper adulthood, not just, once people hit 18, this kind of balances out and the numbers get more even. But it's like at school, for example, it's the boys who stand out and who are then being diagnosed. So no surprise then, perhaps, that previous research largely overlooks the lived experience of women. So this is a big problem. The other problem is that there's often a gender bias in terms of study participants. So there are some studies that kind of looked at who the participants were in these studies. And one found that only 19% of studies on ADHD actually included women. And another one found that almost 100%, so 99.6% of single-sex studies are on men. So obviously this underlying idea that the default human is male is highly problematic, and Rachel and I are very happy to talk about this for hours on end afterwards. But yeah, so this is something that's so we can quite clearly see how research on ADHD is gendered in itself, right from the methodology, right from the way it's been designed and set up. Right, then ADHD and leadership, similarly problematic, because there is only very little research on ADHD and leadership in a workplace context. And also gender is relevant here because, again, the popular media or mainstream media is very good at publishing lists of famous people with ADHD, famous leaders with ADHD, who then talk about how wonderful and liberating it is to have ADHD. But most of the people on this list are male. So there are people like Richard Branson, Bill Gates, very few, if any, women on this list. In fact, we couldn't remember one, but maybe we need to look again. There's, however, some research that talks about positive effects of ADHD with regards to entrepreneurship. And this will also become relevant in one of the quotes that we'll show you later, and some research that has identified or frames neurodiversity as a competitive advantage. There's also a little bit of self-help literature out there, so texts like Survive and Thrive, 4 ways ADHD makes you a better business leader, and being a leader with ADHD. So you get the idea by just looking at the titles. Now, bringing everything then together, bringing ADHD, gender, and leadership together, we kind of find that women are often absent, as I said, from this list of famous neurodiverse leaders. And which kind of makes it even more complex for them in the workplace, because as we know, women often experience a lot of difficulties anyway around the glass ceiling, for example, the pay gap, etc., etc. So if you add ADHD to this mix, then you know, things get even more complicated, and we'll talk a little bit about this intersectionality later. And we've got the quote here about the challenges around navigating the neurodivergent glass ceiling, which obviously is even more challenging for women than for men. Also, this lack of ADHD, women occupying leadership roles, or I should perhaps say this visible lack of ADHD women occupying leadership roles is a problem. So because we know that a lot of neurodivergent women in leadership positions mask their neurodiversity for various reasons, including stigma. So we don't know how many there are, and obviously having them not there. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about this later, why this is a problem. So yeah, so this is the background against kind of which we're doing the study, and in which against which Rachel's PhD is located. And so the aims of what we're doing today is to explore the ways in which ADHD, gender, and leadership intersect with each other. We'll do this by exploring the lived experience of a professional woman diagnosed with ADHD, and with the aim of giving her a voice. And we hope to explore how leadership and gender intersect in stories of her experiences of ADHD at work. And we've selected 2 relatively short stories, because it's always difficult to give you longer stories on a PowerPoint to demonstrate this. And we hope that in doing this, we contribute to research that frames ADHD as an advantage rather than a problem or a deficit. And at this point, I hand over to Rachel. Do you want me to click, or are you happy to click?
No, I can click it. Thanks very much. So I'm Rachel. I am the person in this research with ADHD as a woman, and also I work a full-time job as a commercial director while I'm also doing my PhD part-time. So that kind of sets the context for that. And I think it's what we're going to show you is a little bit about why this research is personal, and then move on to the framework and methodology. So for me, in my career, I've always been made to feel like an outlier. Like once people got past the kind of enthusiastic Rachel or the fun Rachel, like my personality didn't fit. And I was often told that sentence, that my personality didn't fit, I didn't fit in. And it was heartbreaking, really. I just didn't really understand how I could change something so fundamental as my personality. Like, why was my identity being questioned? It's a very overwhelming feeling. And it led me to try everything I could possibly think of. Make myself smaller, be more detailed, talking less, talking quietly. Clearly, as you will experience today, none of that worked at all. I just bounced back to being the lovely version of me that I really enjoy. And then when I was 45, I was diagnosed with ADHD. And that was the moment for me that everything in my career fell into place. And it explained everything in a really positive way. I'm not interested in looking back and saying, why didn't this happen? For me, it's about, this is great. Like, now I understand it. It isn't my personality. My personality is great. Thanks. But I work in a company that being neurodivergent would not be accepted. And so I choose not to disclose at work. So I'm one of those women that are hidden, that don't disclose at work. But I also work in a business where the people that I work with, both as a peer group and as my CEO, who I report to, are the opposite side of the personality kind of wheel, as it were, to me. So it's a very interesting place to understand this. But as Stephanie said, we know that gender has an impact on us, and a significant impact on leadership, and I myself have understood this. So what I kept thinking was, well, was I alone? Did other women in my position share my experience, or was it really just me, as I've kind of been told all my life? And if it isn't, like, what can we learn from that knowledge? How can it help other women in a similar situation? And almost, is it possible to kind of find language that can help me explain my neurodivergency to others at work without having to disclose? And so that's where this research was born. So let me take you briefly through the framework and the methodology and data collection, and then we'll jump straight into the analysis. So I'm not going to talk too much about social constructionism, as this audience clearly knows far more than me as a baby PhD student at this time. But the two kind of real pillars of this framework are identity and intersectionality. So there are 5 principles from Brooks Olsen Hall of identity framework will really allow for the exploration of identity through language. So really be able to understand that and look at those stories in the various different ways. And then we're going to layer on this other framework of intersectionality, which allows for the fact that we're looking at women in leadership roles, where gender comes into it, we know, where race comes into it, where sexuality, where disability, and so on. All of these other things can be layered up. And intersectionality allows for us to understand multiple intersecting identities. And so that is they're the pillars of the framework for this research. So let me talk you through the methodology. It's probably worth saying at this point that for this research, both this and the actual PhD study, when I'm using the term women, I'm also including people who identify as women, and also include trans and non-binary people as well. So it's an all-encompassing study, though we're just using women to shorten that sentence, basically. So let me tell you a little bit about what I think is the kind of quite innovative methodology, but I know I'm not usually allowed to use that word. But as being me and a woman in leadership with ADHD, so person that could be a participant, it was really important for me that I understood that my story was out there as well. And so finding a methodology that I was able to insert myself as a almost participant and researcher in was incredibly important. So we have mixed autoethnography, and then we've also put in co-constructed interviews. So I knew that I wouldn't be able to be very good at traditional interviewing people and taking the researcher role of not interacting very much with the participants. So we found a way that I could interact with participants and really get lots and lots of rich data from this. So for this talk, the data we've got is from the autoethnographic side of the data, and then I'll explain a little bit about how the PhD and the wider study continues with the co-constructed interviews. So let me jump to this slide. So this is stage 1 and 2 are what we're talking about and what we have the data for today. So stage 1 is a researcher journal. So I've been keeping a journal of things and incidents and stories and things that have happened over the course of the last 6 months, and that continues to be the case. And then to get the wider view of my lived experience, we also conducted a pilot interview where I was interviewed by an experienced interviewer to get and facilitate to be able to talk about things that have happened in my career that may have been a long time ago. So a wider, longer term view of my career. And then if you can see the little C in the blue triangle, that means that that's when data is then coded, which is what we're going to show you today. Stage 3 is because the pilot interview worked really well, stage 3 is a longer pilot interview, again with the same interviewer, but to get more data and more richness and more stories, and then that's coded. And then stage 4 and 5 are the participant data, and this is the co-constructed interviews. And the idea of these interviews is that the stories from the stages 1 to 3 will then be used to help prompt and elicit responses from participants. And then as they share their stories, further data is then co-constructed between the participant and myself, and that's what results in these co-constructed interviews. So let's have a little look at how the data is then coded. So we're going to look at the data from 1 and 2 and how it was coded. So We took the autoethnographic pilot interview and the journal, and all of it was microcoding. And so that was where the stories were given lots of different codes that were associated with them to start narrowing it down and understanding what themes were coming out, what was happening, and where they sat, for example. And then the second stage of that was macro coding, and this then involved the framework codes. So the intersectional social categories such as gender or age, for example, disability, were then added on to those stories as codes. And the identity framework from Brooks and Hall, so whether the story showed evidence of indexicality or positionality, for example, and those codes were added to those stories. And then once this was done, then it was ready to be analysed. And as I say, for this, we've done stage 1 and 2, so just those autoethnographic parts, and then stage 3 and 5 are the next exciting bits of code. So let me just show you how that looks in the reality. So I'm going to show you a slide. I'm not expecting you to see all the detail. It's just to kind of give you that visual example of what the macro and micro codes are. So on the left-hand side of this slide, there are lots of some of the micro codes. So you can see things like being neurodivergent, conflict, diagnosis, things like that. They were attached to stories, and you can see in the different columns that they are the journal and then the first pilot interview, and then how many stories were coded with these codes under that. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, you can then see the macro codes of the framework. So you can see both the frameworks from the identity, so indexicality, for example, and you can also see the intersectionality frameworks. So that is an idea of how the kind of codes come out. And then this just shows how it looks in real life, just to make it a little bit simpler for me to explain. So if you take one code, one of the micro codes, like being neurodivergent, you can see then that there are stories within this code of being neurodivergent that fit within the larger framework of gender, disability, and age. And you can also see that as there are stories that show positionality and indexicality. And so that's where I'm hoping that then it kind of becomes a little bit clear about how we're going to kind of code everything and how it all looks. So I'm going to pass you back to Stephanie, who's going to take you through the analysis. But what we thought it would be fun to do, because rather than Stephanie read out my words, we thought it'd be fun for actually me to read out the words. So I'm going to read the stories and then Stephanie's going to tell you all the analysis. So here is story 1. So it's so exhausting hiding myself and making myself smaller to fit these boxes that are imposed by work, culture, society, and other people. Are we really saying that the best way is simply the way of the masses? Because a larger percentage of people think like an Excel spreadsheet. Are we saying that therefore this is the correct way to think? No wonder so many people with neurodiversity decide to branch out on their own.
Thanks, Rachel. So we should probably say this was one of the excerpts that was produced during the first interview, during the first relatively short interview that Rachel has done. Okay, so yeah, we don't have time to talk about everything in great detail. So we've kind of highlighted some of the bits that we wanted to talk about. And the first thing that you see about this story is how the story challenges mainstream discourses of ADHD as a disability. And so it does this, for example, by asking questions. So are we saying, and especially again, like you can really see how the really questions the mainstream discourse. Then the sarcasm, people think like an Excel spreadsheet. We can also see in this and also in the other example that we'll show you in a second, how the storyteller creates this dichotomy, initially between herself and others. So if we look at the first sentence where she talks about herself and then a lot of bigger other kind of collectives, and where she really kind of positions herself in contrast to them. So me versus work, culture, society, and other people. What's really interesting about this example, and it'd be interesting, I know we've got lots of time to discuss this at the end, to see what you make of the pronouns, because it's something that we're a little bit, it's complex, so I think we haven't quite unraveled this yet. But what we can see throughout the story is this kind of shift in perspective that takes place. So initially she talks about myself, And then she moves to a we, and it's not quite clear who this we involves. Is this we the people who think that neurodivergent people are a problem, or is who is this we, and is the storyteller actually part of the we, or is this more like the, I don't know, like, does she say we but actually mean they? Because if we go further down the story, and again I've highlighted this in red, when she talks about so many people with neurodiversity, then they are there. Okay, so there's a lot happening here in terms of positionality, and I'm sure Rachel will unpack this in her thesis. So today we're not really talking about identity. We leave this for Rachel's thesis. And then again, and really important in this story is how it ends with this emphasis on the success of neurodiverse people, but how at the same time an acknowledgement that this success is not possible in a standard context. Okay, so they branch out, just like many of the famous people with neurodiversity that the media keeps talking about, who then did their own thing and became super famous. Okay, so I might just skip over this because I think I've said pretty much all of this, and I know we're a bit short of time. Yeah, so we've got one more story, and I'll hand over to Rachel in a second. So this time, this isn't from the interview. This time, this is taken from a diary entry, and the story was a bit longer, so we've cut out bits to make it fit onto one slide.
Yeah. So today I had a call with the CEO of a clothing company. By the end of the call, she had offered me a job. I know that seems a little crazy, but she was like, when I can afford you, come and work here. It's always strange to me that people really like me, all the things in me, like passion, enthusiasm, quick thinking, clear vision when they first meet me. And these turn out to be the things that they then don't like in me when we work together. These are all the areas that they then want to change. I was once told by a former boss, CEO, that this was because people realized they came up with answers too quickly and it made them look bad and their ego couldn't handle it. Why is that my problem, though? Is it my gender? Do men with ADHD or this personality trait have the same problem? Or is this seen as go-getting? It certainly felt like it was gender when I was being told this by a white man 30 years older than me.
Thanks, Rachel. Okay, we'll do the same as we've done with the previous example, just highlighting one or two things. So this again is such an interesting and such a complex story. And the bit we wanted to highlight here in terms of the lived experiences is how, excuse me, the storyteller talks about how others change, and of course, how others' perception of herself changes. And of course, in doing this, she accomplishes a number of quite interesting things. So one of them is that she challenges mainstream discourses of ADHD. So just like in the previous story, she highlights the positives of having been diagnosed with ADHD, such as having passion, enthusiasm, quick thinking, clear vision, and coming up with answers quickly, which then is also turned into a disadvantage, or framed as a disadvantage. So on the one hand, she highlights these kind of positives, but she at the same time contrasts them with these changing views of others, and thereby she also constructs this me versus them dichotomy. So this is perhaps even clearer in this story than in the previous one, where again, if you look at the pronouns, there's a lot of me and I versus them. So yeah, that came through quite strongly. The thing that's really powerful about this story is that it really shifts the blame and relocates the problem. It even challenges, what exactly kind of mainstream ideas or mainstream views of the problem are. So she clearly rejects it. Why is that my problem? It's not her problem. And she kind of, as I said, kind of relocates it by saying, it made them look bad, and they couldn't handle it, or their ego couldn't handle it. And also this story is really interesting because it quite explicitly brings in gender, age, and ethnicity. And yeah, the white old man kind of encapsulates all of this quite nicely. So yeah, so this is a really powerful full story, as I said, and it's quite interesting because there's a lot going on in terms of intersectionality there, in terms of gender, leadership, and ADHD kind of coming together. And I just skip over this, and we've got plenty of time to discuss this later. But I just wanted to mention that to come to the discussion, and then give the last slide to Rachel. So what we've seen, we've obviously only had time to look at 2 fairly short stories today, but what we've seen is that these stories are really powerful in terms of challenging mainstream discourses around ADHD of work. Not only do they emphasize the benefits and advantages, but they also, in the last story has shown this particularly, but we've got others who do this, they relocate the problem and they shift the blame. So they, as I said, they kind of challenge what exactly the problem is. So it's not being diagnosed with ADHD, but it's people not being able to deal with it, so in a way, we read this as challenging mainstream reality and creating an alternative reality. And Rachel will say more about this, but it's really important to tell other stories, to tell alternative stories, to share the lived experience, to kind of create this reality around what ADHD is, how it works at work, and how it intersects with gender and leadership. So with regards to leadership then, as we've seen in the story, there's quite a strong sense of overcoming this feeling of being forced and violated into small boxes. And it'll be really interesting to see how this pans out in the later stages of the research, when Rachel will conduct these co-constructed interviews. So rather than viewing or framing ADHD as a problem and kind of an obstacle to success, it's very much framed in the stories as a reason to grow and be independent, and actually to venture out into leadership and taking on leadership roles. So as we've seen in the last story, kind of bringing in gender, age, and ethnicity, they intersect with ADHD and professionalism in quite complex ways in a lot of the stories that we have. And obviously the last story was really, kind of quite nicely illustrates this with her comments about the white old man, which are synonymous for the rigid establishment that doesn't allow diversity and resist change. I think I will hand over to you, Rachel, for final words. And then we're almost in the time.
I mean, there was lots of things I could have put on this looking forward slide, but Stephanie said the coolest thing about challenging mainstream reality, and now I've decided that that's the only thing I want to ever do. And that's the vision for this research, like those stories, having those stories, talking about those stories, sharing those stories, not only in the wider place outside of this research and once the research is finished and through the research, but also when you're having those conversations with the participants as well, with the other women in leadership who have ADHD, will already be really empowering. Like, I know how this has impacted my working life already, and how empowered I feel, and how I can see language and the way I can use language being changing because of this, the work that I'm doing just with this study. So this is really exciting. And I think one of the things that we're most excited about is because of this not unique, but slightly more unusual position of me working and not working in a kind of a role that or a workplace environment that is that accepting of neurodivergency, and also working in an environment that is very, I work in a sales environment, that's my job. So it's very different to other things we're doing. And I think being able to mix that experience and understand then how to pass this research out and how it can be used in research and within companies to be really impactful, I think that's going to be the most exciting thing. And plus, very soon I get to do the interviews and speak to other people like me. So I'm very excited. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Loads of claps. I'm going to stop the